So this is a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya called Malunkyya Putta, and he was an arahant at the end of his life, I think. But in the sutta, he goes to the Buddha and asks him to teach, to get a teaching, and the Buddha asks him some questions, and then gives him instruction, and then Malunkyya Putta responds with sort of in brief to explain that how he understood what the Buddha meant. But I want to bring up this verse, which is the same in the Bahia Sutta. So the Buddha asks this monk, "What do you think? Do you have any desire, lust or affection for those forms cognizable by the eye, that are unseen by you, never seen before, that you don't see, and that are not seen by you now?" So do you have any desire or love for those?
The things that you haven't experienced with your senses.
Yeah. And he replies, no.
Yeah, that's like the what I said before a number of times. It's like which is more. The whole point of that is like to that reflection is to think: do you have lust for things? Can you have lust for things you haven't seen? It's inconceivable. So having seen something is a prerequisite for lust, which means lust is not in seeing, not in the sight, not in the sight objects. It's basically you're responsible for having lust towards that which is seen. And one of the reasons why people would have lust towards that which is seen is because they take for granted that which is seen. They take for granted their sense organs as their own, as owned, providers of pleasure and so on. So then whatever you see, it's the thing you see. You're fully centered around that. But if you actually stop and think about it, and doesn't matter what you see, what you have lust towards, just kind of look at the context of that experience and see, well, okay, I've seen this, but which is more, things I haven't seen in my life or things I've seen? You realize that things you've seen are always going to be inferior to everything else you haven't seen, everything else your eyes have not experienced.
It could be seen.
They could be seen, but when they are seen, then they become that which is seen, which means there is always going to be more of that which is not seen. So can you have lust for that which is not seen? That's inconceivable. So the basis for non-lust is actually greater than the basis for lust. And also, by thinking like this, you realize then that anything you have seen was purely circumstantial. You realize, oh, I could have not seen it. It could have not been. It was, but it could have not been. So anything else then, with that framework, with that established context, anything else that you see now, you see against that kind of context of, oh, it could have not arisen, which means I didn't have say in its arising. Thus, you're already much less centered around things you see, much less absorbed in them, which means much less like narrower basis for the possibility of lust, because that loss of context and revolving around that being absorbed in seen, heard, smelled, taste, touched fully without any peripheral awareness in regard to it, that is where the lust breeds and multiplies and grows and expands. So things you've seen are always secondary to things you haven't seen. They're always circumstantial because you've seen them. So you realize your lust is always secondary. If you were to cultivate the foundation of just the recognition of everything that you haven't seen as a necessary basis for non-lust, it would be impossible for you to maintain the lust towards things you are seeing here and now.
So you're recognizing that non-desire, that non-lust, in regard to the immensity of all the possible things that could
it all comes down to that practical, basically undermining of that centeredness upon things you've seen, things you heard, things you taste, touched, and so on. When I say centeredness, I mean that absorption in sense objects by default, like a default mode of being. So you want to sort of start eroding that gratuitous perception. And one of the ways is recognizing that anything you've seen, anything you will see, anything you're seeing now is fundamentally circumstantial, because it's always against the backdrop of everything else not seen, everything else that you've never seen and hasn't been seen. So that kind of puts the current lust towards things you see in a better perspective.
And also, it also reminds me of the danger that as I'm lusting after a sight or an experience, but this is a circumstantial thing, and
Exactly.
how much more experiences are
Well,
there?
that's the thing. I'm lusting after. I'm founding my entire being, my entire mental state, all the actions, choices that they will then affect me in the future upon something utterly circumstantial. Because if you were to remember that what you are like currently, you're focused on the object of your sight, fully lustful, fully committed to getting more of it, and then you develop context of its circumstantial nature against everything else that you haven't seen and you could have not seen and you won't see, immediately there is already like a buffer zone between you and that gratuitous absorption with the sense objects. Because I've seen it and it's great, but did I have seen its arising? Did I have seen that seeing? Did I have seen how that thing manifested or whatever? No. You were just subjected to all of these things, yet you took them as if you are in control, you are the owner, you are the kind of, you hold the reins of it. But you don't. You don't hold the reins even in regard to your own senses, let alone that which comes through your senses to you, the sense objects.
The idea that there's so many more things to see.
Yeah.
So many more things I could see.
Well, that's the thing.
Isn't that wonderful?
That thought would be on the level of you are still absorbed in the content of your seeing. Because if you actually develop the context of everything else that hasn't been seen is greater, the thought of all of the other things I would see wouldn't matter in its content, because you would see, it doesn't matter what I see in the future, it's always going to be secondary to the framework of everything else not seen. So if you do lust for everything, the new things you could see means you have lost the sight of the framework. You have basically obscured the context. Because it doesn't matter what you see.
Never.
It doesn't matter how many things you see, how many times you see it. By being seen becomes second. Seeing it makes it second. And then you realize, oh, so there is no way for me to access it without seeing it, with the lust. So if I want to act out of lust, I have to make myself second to this. By acting out of lust, you put the second as first. You put the particular things that circumstantially have been seen, you make that the center of your experience and your action and your choices, which means you then become dependent upon that which is already second. And that's the simile of when the Buddha says chasing after sense objects. It's like climbing the tree to eat the mangoes at the top, and then somebody comes who can't climb the tree, but he can cut the tree. So when he starts cutting the tree, he's not cutting you, he's not attacking you with the axe, but he's removing that upon which you stand, those sense objects that you're currently committed to. And unless you quickly withdraw yourself from those sense objects, i.e. quickly come down the tree, you will suffer death or deadly suffering. So if you have lust, means you have already perverted the picture. You have already put the second as first and first as second. First is everything else not seen. First is the circumstantial nature of seen. If you maintain that, doesn't matter what future seeing, what possibility of future seeing, it will all have to come second to the framework of everything else not seen. And that's exactly how you develop your mind above lust. You don't develop your mind above lust by never perceiving anything beautiful in the world. You develop your mind above lust by not being able to pervert that order ever again in the world. Doesn't matter what you see.
So what is much more non-lust?
Yeah, from that point of view, you realize that basically the absence of lust is greater.
Many
And that's why it is possible to overcome sensuality as kind of hard as it is. It's still possible because it's fundamentally second. If sensuality were truly rooted in things you see and the way you see them, it would be impossible, and it wouldn't be a problem then. You wouldn't need to free yourself from it. But the reason why sensuality is a problem, because it requires that perversion of that perception. It requires distortion. It requires the wrong view. It requires implicit risk of committing to that which is circumstantial. I mean, like imagine somebody offers you here's a car for you, drive it for free. Brand new car, keys, never driven. By the way, it might have a bomb rigged to it. It might go off, it might not go off. Would you risk it? Would you risk it even touching the door handle? No, I'd rather walk. Thank you very much. Oh, here is a drink. Enjoy it. It's beautiful in every regard. It might be poisonous, by the way. So you wouldn't do it then, because see, doesn't matter the appeal of the sense object, how much you lusted for this type of car or for that type of drink. Now, with the framework, with the context properly established, this is basically establishing your own core upon something utterly circumstantial, that when it changes, it's not if, it's when it changes, you cannot remain unaffected by that. So maintaining that context, doesn't matter what comes in your field of vision, you will not have lust towards it, because the peril will be apparent, the danger becomes apparent, as we would say.
You lose sight of that.
Well, it's mutually exclusive. You can't have the context of the danger, the risk, the circumstantial nature, and enjoy the object of that, which is circumstantial and risky. The only way to enjoy it is to not see the risk.
No matter what I haven't seen, if I see it, it's not going to
Exactly.
be a problem.
So it's not like I must never see, like you will not seek things out, but if they do arise, you will not be overwhelmed or afraid or trying to avoid it either. So in the scene, they will just be the scene. There will be no avoiding it or trying to prolong nothing. Just in the scene, there is just the scene, because in the scene there is no more perversion of the context of the scene.
And that's that verse.
Yeah.
That the Buddha then gives Mulankiyaputta instructions how to train. And I'll just read it out quickly. There's obviously so many different translations.
Sure.
Slightly. It says, when regarding things seen, heard, sensed and cognized by you, in the seen there will be merely the seen. In the heard there will be merely the heard, in the sense there will be merely the sensed, and the cognized there will be merely the cognized. Then you will not be by that.
That by which you're defined. You won't be, basically you won't, that's what I mean, like when you establish your being upon that lust towards the seen, it defines you. As I said, your ownership, things you are committed to emotionally, things you crave for, things you want to have, things you want to protect having and so on, that is what defines you. That is what your sense of self is. And there's that sutta where the Buddha says that King Mahasabhasena basically said he was defined by his possession. He said if that king wouldn't have the king's horses, king's wives, king's palaces, king's army, would he be the king? Could he act as a king? No. But because he has these things, that's why he is the king. But in the mind that is already perverted with this lust, you think you are the king first. And that's that the most fundamental distortion that Puthujjana does. You think things are yours because you are. It's actually the other way around. You are. You have a sense of self for whatever it is because you keep owning things gratuitously. And you keep owning them because you don't see them as circumstantial. You don't see them as subject to change. So even when the change happens, blatantly in your face, you don't see that as a relevant symptom or that undermines your ownership because you assumed yourself to come first. So you then just isolate these examples when change goes against you and undermines your ownership and undermines your sense of self, and then just try to cover it up with other things, getting the new property and new ownership and new possessions. That's why sensuality, basically a form of owning and consumption, is the only way that Puthujjana knows how to deal with any discomfort emotionally that he experiences. He doesn't know how to escape the painful feeling in any other way except turning towards sensuality and trying to basically cover it up with new stuff. But the fact is that things could change against your will, means that fundamentally they cannot be owned. Even if you are owning them now, it's not the ownership that you assume you have, which is the ownership of control and mastery over these things.
So when you see the circumstantial nature of these...
By dwelling basically that circumstantial context, you will be unable to not include yourself in it as well. You're going to start feeling it, in other words. So you start contemplating the circumstantial nature of your possessions, and sooner or later you're going to feel a pang of dukkha, basically, when you touch upon something that's dear to you, and now you start contemplating it as perishable. And then he says, oh, so then you yourself are equally subject to these things.
Yeah, I mean, the body is the closest, isn't it?
Well, the body is the closest, yeah, but it's also the hardest one to see, because through the body you get the pleasure upon which you develop yourself as dependent upon the sense objects. So you don't even see the body correctly, in other words. Even when people say, yes, the body is anicca, unless you feel anxiety and fear on account of it, you're not doing it rightly. You're not seeing the anicca of the body, or you might be an arahant. But again, you wouldn't then be listening to these instructions if you were, so more likely you're not. So that's the point. Your sense of self, your sense of everything, basically, ownerships and views and everything, it's because you possess things first. It's because every single individual time you engage with the objects of your senses, you do so ignorantly. You do so without the right context. You do so without maintaining the recognition that they're circumstantial throughout. Not in the beginning, but now it's final. In the beginning, in the middle, in the end, doesn't matter what point you engage with things, they remain in their nature, in their core, circumstantial, anicca. Fundamentally, you give possessions by correcting the distortion that these possessions have, that the lust towards the possession have basically maintained. So in the scene, there's just the scene. There's no distortion. Clear. But for somebody without the right context, in the scene, well, there is lust, there is sense of self, there is ownership, there is basically perception of permanence, there's everything, just in the scene.
Towards away.
Yeah, exactly. So they're defined by the scene. Or they're in the scene. Or they're different from the scene. Either way, there's all this mess caused by lust towards the scene. Not by the scene, by the way.
When you are not by that, then you will not be therein.
Yeah, that's basically living in, pretty much seeing yourself as in the same world of all these objects that you own. That's just proliferation of that self-view. Because it can kind of grow infinitely.
Proliferates.
So to speak. Yeah. So through being defined by pretty much objects of your senses, by things you see, smell, taste, touch, by chasing the pleasure of these things, you become a being that's in the world of these sense objects. And that's why a thought of sense restraint, a thought of not chasing the sensual pleasure first, and if, like in the beginning, if the mind is not trained, will fill you with anxiety and terror.
This will kill me.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It will
This will kill the level of me that I proliferated to. And that's what I'm saying. People, like even people who are not into practice, when they get to, you chase sensuality to the point of basically, if you don't meet the required threshold of engagement with your sense objects, you start experiencing basically very painful psychological states.
Loss of existence.
Yeah, exactly. Like vacuum and dread and fear and all this. And then you quickly need to find activities and things to do and things to keep yourself occupied. But then equally, if you actually are able to not kind of give in to that anxiety and be overwhelmed by it, and endure it and refuse to engage with the sense object to the same extent, you are diminishing that gratuitously proliferated being in that world of sense objects. And you can do so by maintaining the context of the circumstantial nature towards things you want to engage with. Because that's another thing. If you were, I have all this, I need to do this, if you re-establish the context of circumstantial nature, even of the possibilities of things you could do, you already lost the lust towards doing them. And then you'll end up just doing things you have to do, things that are practical in nature, that are required, or whatever. You wouldn't be doing them out of lust, in other words.
That verse continues, when you are not therein, then you will be neither here nor beyond nor in between the two. This itself is the end of suffering. So that's the instruction to Malankya-Putta, and then Malankya-Putta says to the Buddha, I understand in detail, Venerable Sir, the meaning of what was stated by the Blessed One in brief. And this is his verse, which is also found in the Therigatha. So let's see. Having seen a form with mindfulness confused, attending to the pleasing sign,
Having seen the form with context confused.
With recollectedness lost.
Yeah. Without the right context, without the right recollectedness, having seen the form without a context, you will be confused with it. Like you're already putting it first, as opposed to second. You're not seeing the right order.
You'll be attending to the pleasing sign.
Yeah.
Or that
means you're already pulled by pleasure. And the only, as I said in the beginning of this talk, the way to not be pulled by pleasure is not to never see things, but to never lose the context. Because context means recognition of the right order. If there is already lust, means there is absence of context. You always start with lust. You always start with perversion. It's a mode of being. So it takes effort of going against that grain to develop the right context. And then, yeah, sure, the point will come where it will be a matter of choice, of a clearer kind, where you can clearly see mindfulness of lust, or lust.
And one experiences it with an infatuated mind.
Yeah.
And remains holding to it.
Yeah, assuming it. Assuming it in that wrong order.
Yeah. And many feelings grow.
Yeah.
Originating from that sight.
So that's what I mean, like your mode of being becomes dependent upon the sight, sound, smell, taste, touches, which means now everything you start experiencing feelings on account of it is now on top of that. So you're just proliferating more and more.
It's becoming more.
That's what, like any sensual, basically, if sensuality is not kept in check, for most people by circumstances or by limited access to it, everybody would be an addict. And most people are, one way or the other. So that's what I mean, like it's not a static thing, okay, I'll just enjoy sensuality and then I'll restrain myself. No. Each time you enjoy sensuality means next time you'll need to enjoy more of it. Your being grows towards it. You're becoming more dependent upon it. So it's not a static thing. And that's the danger you have to recognize as well. When people think, okay, no, I understand this, I'll restrain later. Later might be too late, as in might be too much. You only have maybe a certain limited of capacity to withdraw yourself from it. And if you overflow that being of sensuality, you will not have means of basically digging yourself out of it anymore. You became too dependent.
So many feelings grow, originating from that sight, covetousness and annoyance as well, by which one's mind becomes disturbed.
Yeah.
For one who accumulates suffering like this, Nibbana is said to be far away.
Yeah.
Pressure.
Yeah, it's just more and more and more, just piling things up. And then even when a person with all that piled up on him thinks about Nibbana, he will think it in terms of that pile, basically. For him, Nibbana will be another central thing, the greatest fulfillment of desire, the greatest bliss, the greatest pleasure, which is just the extension of everything else he's been chasing so far. So that's what I mean, like when I said before, Nibbana is closer to death for a Putujana than basically that which he thinks Nibbana is. And that's why, again, numerous times in the suttas, when the Buddha would talk to lay people, some of them would ask, and he would give them the description of what Nibbana is, and they would go completely distraught. Absolute breakdown, mental breakdown, fall on the ground, agony, pulling this, like, oh, that will kill me, that will destroy me. That liberation is the death of me, because it is. It's the death of your sense of self, i.e. proliferated being upon sense objects, feelings on account of it, cravings and so on. Assumptions, of course. And yeah, that's why the true practice is more, practically speaking, more often than not, it will be unpleasant for people, certainly in the beginning. Because it's going to be about undoing your sense of self, not finding that last missing bit that will make you full and completed into this ultimate joy of Nibbana. No, it's undoing that whole stinky pile of sensual rubbish. And the more you accumulate, the more work you have to basically do to clean it up. So that's the carelessness, when Buddha goes about carelessness, it's basically fundamentally procrastination. Like people who read the suttas recognize what needs to be done, but then keep sort of absolving themselves from the sense of duty to do it, or kind of postponing it, or later, wait for the right conditions, wait for this, you're just procrastinating, which means it's not a static thing. So your procrastination, for as long as it lasts, results in accumulation of more things for that period of time that you then have to clean. So you couldn't make yourself clean your room when it was barely cluttered because you were procrastinating. Now, because of your procrastination, you have 100 times more things to clean. Good luck starting now. So the burden accumulates.
Because that's been your practice.
Yeah, that's been your mode of being. Postponing it.
And it continues with when recollected, when you have that context, mindfulness, one sees a form, one is not inflamed by lust for that sight. One experiences it with a dispassionate mind and does not remain holding. One lives recollected, mindful, in such a way that even as one sees the form and while one undergoes a feeling, suffering is diminished, not built up.
Because there's no craving that's being basically cultivated towards it.
And for one,
you prioritize the context, not the content of your experience. Fundamentally, that's what it is.
Yeah, and for one dismantling suffering like that, Nibbana is said to be close by.
Exactly.
So
he's already peeling off all these layers. Like a skilled butcher, cutting up a cow, as we described. Cleaning and cleaning, polishing. Because that's the thing. Even on the most like a mundane level of practice, I don't know. You see somebody and it's upsetting to you, or you see somebody and you're infected with lust. Doesn't matter. The point is, the context is there is a lustful mind. The context is there is an angry mind. Doesn't matter who it is. The content of that experience is the person you're angry with or the person you're lustful towards. So you always have a choice. That's what I mean. Sense restraint fundamentally is done blindly, but it actually, the reason why it's necessary and why it's wholesome, because it emulates the Nibbana. Absence of sensuality is what Nibbana is. Absence of possibility of lust is what Nibbana is. And that is basically outlined through sense restraint. Now, of course, you need to develop understanding through that sense restraint, but without sense restraint, there is no place for understanding to occur. So even on that mundane level, you have a choice whether to leap into the content of your experience, and he is the reason of my anger, or think about him because you are angry, or abstain from giving in to that pull, to that burden that's kind of weighing on you to go that way, and stay on the level of the context, which is angry mind endures. If you lapse from the context, you find yourself thinking about the person you're angry with. You re-establish the context, anger is there, I don't care on account of what. You're already not particularly acting towards craving and feeling and aversion towards person you hate. Same with the lust. Lustful mind is there.
Circumstantial.
Well, by staying on the level of the context, the circumstantial nature of that basically person that made you angry becomes apparent. Because then you also realize, I was angry yesterday with somebody else. So anger is not solely confined to this phase, although that's how it seems when it's present. No, it's him. No, anger is first, not that which made you angry, seemingly. Again, putting the second as the first, as the basis, as the root of your anger. No. The angry mind is the first, not that which you've seen that made you angry. That's always the second because you've seen it. So same, lustful thoughts, angry thoughts, whatever it is, but it's pulling towards, pulling away, you want to have it, you want to destroy it, you want to kill it, you want to possess it. All of that is engagement with the content at the expense of the context. You can't have it both. You can't be mindful, as in have the right context, and engage in sensuality. It's mutually exclusive. Practically speaking, even on the most mundane level of practice, every single time you have a possibility to make the right choice. To restrain and stay on the level of the context and endure it if it's painful, which it will be, or to sort of jump into the content and then psychologize and whatever else, and deal with feel more and deal with your feelings. All of that is secondary to you making the wrong choice already. Choice that basically reinforced the already existing perversion of putting first as second and second as first.